You're listening to the Holistic Nootropics Podcast, your home for holistic, evidence-based cognitive enhancement strategies. And now your host, Eric Levi.
Sara Russell, thank you for joining me today on the Holistic Nootropics Podcast.
Thank you so much for having me, Eric.
So I'm excited to talk to you today because you're one of the few people I see out there in this holistic health space, really the health space in general, specifically talking about things like heavy metal toxicity, even more specifically mercury. And as a, nutritional therapy practitioner and as part of this journey into the holistic mind-body connection, the more that I read about mercury specifically, the more I'm starting to understand how devastating it is to the brain. And really, a major part of the population could potentially be dealing with this toxicity. So I was hoping maybe you could talk a little bit about, your background and how you got into studying mercury and why you believe it's such a big deal.
Sure. Yeah. Thank you so much for the introduction and all of that. So I got deep into the study of mercury toxicity and the impact on mercury on mineral status in the body and on general overall health, including brain and nervous system health and mental health. I definitely have my own personal journey with mercury toxicity. When I was 18, almost 19, I went to the dentist for the first time in like a decade or something like that. I had a lot of cavities and they were all filled with amalgam fillings. I had no idea there was mercury in there. I knew nothing. And I had a totally conventional Mad Hatter dentist who was totally happy to fill my mouth with that stuff. I had 12 fillings, some of them quite large. And what I remember from, that summer when they were placed, and the transition to my second year in college, I had some significant changes. One of them was I was very anxious. I was depressed. I was angry. I had no idea where all that anger had come from. And the math part of my brain stopped functioning. It was so weird. And when I was in class, I would sometimes just randomly fall asleep, which was totally uncharacteristic for me. So I did not connect that to mercury toxicity until many years later. In the meantime, I had some immune system dysregulation and some autoimmune type responses that were just kind of generically diagnosed as fibromyalgia. Then I also developed chronic migraine and retinal degeneration in the form of severe pigmentation in my retina that, basically the eye doctor told me that I should never drive because my visual field was so damaged. I had some pretty severe sensory integration issues and on and off like insomnia type, on and off cycles of insomnia. Years later, when I went in for follow-up dental work, I slowly started having my amalgam fillings removed and replaced because they had started breaking down. I had a totally conventional dentist. I had no idea how dangerous it was. But slowly but surely, I started getting better as those fillings were removed. And thank goodness I did not have a strong reaction to the mercury that was stirred up temporarily during those removals, because some people do have enormous susceptibility. Fast forward to after my nutritional therapy certification, I still was very naive about mercury and still not really aware of its centrality in my health journey. Then I had an infected root canal from a broken tooth that had cracked 3 or 4 years prior during a car accident that I had as a pedestrian. And when that tooth cracked and the first holistic dentist I went to told me I needed a root canal, I went down a total rabbit hole of dental care and it opened up a brand new world. I refused a root canal. I went to a different holistic dentist who extracted my tooth. And then I connected with some people in my local area who were involved in grassroots activism and research and study on mercury toxicity. And basically, the first year out of my certification through the Nutritional Therapy Association, which I completed in June of 2013, I made a connection with a person who ended up basically mentoring me in mercury toxicity and introducing me to the world of mineral balancing and the connection between toxic metals and mineral transport in the body. In the meantime, I realized that I had passed on some of my mercury toxicity from my last 2 amalgam fillings that were still in my mouth to my youngest child, who was still breastfeeding. We also had the unfortunate occurrence of a broken compact fluorescent light bulb in our house, which was a significant source of mercury toxicity, probably for my son, who actually stopped sleeping in the months following the breaking of this light bulb. And he was crawling at the time on the carpet, and so he probably got exposed to a lot of mercury vapor. So that was my introduction. Definitely not the funnest of initiations, but very, very instructive nonetheless. So from there, I basically ended up taking additional continuing education in the area of mineral balancing and hair test interpretation to further deepen my knowledge of mercury and other toxic metals, as well as synergistic toxicants that may not necessarily be toxic in normal doses, but when, like copper, for example, mixed mercury and copper toxicity is a very gnarly combination that can contribute to oxidative stress in the body and also to physical and mental health issues. So, mercury plus lead is another pretty gnarly combination that can really negatively impact cognitive performance, mental health, and even fertility.
Wow, that's quite a bit to unpack. I mean, I do know a lot of practitioners, who kind of find their route into whatever their niche is because they've dealt with something personally. And it sounds like with mercury, I mean, this has been a constant, feature in your life, whether it's the fillings or the exposure in your home. And I think there's a lot of people who are probably dealing with much of the same. They just don't know it. And they know there's something going on in the body. They know there's some discomfort. And fortunately, you have a medical background where, you were wise to kind of pick up on that. But, how much, especially since you run these hair mineral tests, how ubiquitous is mercury toxicity combined with these other minerals like copper and even lead toxicity?
Yeah. So mercury exposure is absolutely ubiquitous. The question isn't if, but how much. We all vary in terms of the in utero exposure that we receive. For most of us, that is our initiation into mercury toxicity, is developing in utero with a developing nervous system and no cellular defense mechanisms whatsoever. We rely on our mother's detoxification mechanisms. So if we are born to a mother who has amalgam fillings in her mouth or who recently had amalgam fillings removed, keep in mind the half-life of mercury in the brain is 26 years. It's a very, very long half-life. Very, very long. If mercury moves around in the mother's body, as if your mother, when she's pregnant with you, has 5 to 6 amalgam fillings, and chews gum or grinds your teeth, you're getting about 25 micrograms of mercury per day stirred up in the mother's body through the off-gassing, just from the amalgams. Add to that, we don't know how much exactly crosses the placenta, and the few studies that have been done on toxic metals in the placenta have been very, very small, and they have never reported whether or not there was a specific toxic exposure load. So we just don't know very much. And these are tiny, tiny studies. So there hasn't been a systematic effort. There have been cadaver studies done including brain autopsies done in subjects with amalgam fillings. And so we do know that there is a dose-dependent relationship between, specific conditions of neurological and immunological decline and the number of amalgam fillings in the body. But we don't know a huge amount regarding how much mercury crosses the placenta. We just know that babies developing in utero do not have a functioning glutathione system the way that we develop outside of the uterus over time, and that they are completely unequipped for this neurotoxicant. So there is definitely epigenetic toxicity. There have been some good studies published on the epigenetic effect of mercury on, mercury exposure histories, both on the part of the father and the mother, on the epigenetic expression of the fetus. And that definitely is an important consideration as well. So what we do know is that there is an increased incidence of autism and other neurodevelopmental conditions and neuropsychiatric conditions in children whose mothers had a mercury exposure history. And this does appear to be dose dependent as well. So that the higher the number of maternal amalgam fillings, the higher the risk of the baby developing a neurodevelopmental or neuropsychiatric condition such as autism spectrum disorder or other issues. If there's also lead and excess copper in the body, as in late pregnancy, the serum levels of copper do get quite high. That is just physiological and normal because copper increases in the blood along with estrogen. So as estrogen increases during pregnancy, so does copper. So if you have mercury present in the mother's body, that can compound with copper to increase oxidative stress. I have also seen patterns of miscarriage and infertility, even very late miscarriage, like 20 weeks, halfway through the pregnancy, in women who have a significant lead exposure history, and sometimes they are completely unaware. So it's not just mercury, it is other toxic metals as well. The studies have very well documented the fact that, one toxic metal by itself, which is, it's a little bit of a dream or a fantasy, because in real life, we do not just have one toxic metal exposure. Is one thing, but you put 2 or 3 different toxic metals together and they hugely compound each other's toxicity. So there was a famous snail neuron study that exposed the snails to, I think it was 1 part per million just mercury, 1 part per million just aluminum, and then a combined 1 part per million of each. And there was a huge difference. The neuron, 100% of the snail neurons died in the combined mercury and aluminum group, whereas there was a much lower percentage of neuron death in just one or just the other. So we're dealing with a situation of compounded synergistic toxicities that can really affect both, overall function, nutrient status in the body, and definitely brain and nervous system health.
And this is a thing I think about a lot, which is just the sheer amount of toxic metals that we're exposed to on a daily basis, especially something like aluminum or lead or cadmium or any of these different metals, because they're just kind of in our environment. I know, especially with something like aluminum, that's in so many different beauty products. It's in deodorant, not to mention if you're drinking soda out of an aluminum can, or, people like to wrap, food in aluminum wrapping and all these different things. Does tinfoil have? No, tinfoil would have tin. I don't know if it has aluminum, but I know aluminum exposure is very, very prevalent. Lead exposure is just kind of there. And then you have mercury, which, they're literally putting in your body. So, this is a huge issue that, when we talk about especially neurological issues, when we're talking about things like anxiety, depression, even not even going as far as autism, but, we forget just how much of these metals are going on. And then if you put mercury in the pot, it almost seems like mercury, if you start putting all of these different metals into a cooking pot, it's almost like mercury is the heat that starts to make everything bubble up.
Oh yeah, definitely. It's a catalyst of destruction in the body for sure.
Yeah.
And one of the reasons for that is that mercury impairs the production of glutathione, which is the most important antioxidant in the body. So it sort of incapacitates the detoxification of itself, mercury, along with other toxic substances. So it's very dramatic. It depletes nutrient function in the body in a way that it's slightly different for different people. But it's known to, it is one term that I coined along with a colleague. We wrote a paper together entitled Mercury, the quintessential anti-nutrient. And it literally is, really should be thought about as an anti-nutrient, because it really depletes nutrient stores in the body, incapacitating the enzyme systems that are driven by nutrients. And it also impairs the communication along the hypothalamus pituitary adrenal axis. So it can make communication from the hypothalamus and pituitary down to the thyroid, or down to the adrenal glands, or down to, even just the signals for the production of stomach acid. It can make all of that really difficult. It also destroys barriers. So cell membrane, the gut barrier, and the blood-brain barrier, which of course then makes the brain more susceptible to neurotoxicants, including mercury that enter from the bloodstream into the brain. It's really easy for mercury to get into the brain because it is lipophilic, and it's really hard for the mercury to get out of the brain. Mercury also tends to accumulate in thyroid tissue. I have seen a lot of mercury toxicity in clients with Hashimoto's thyroiditis. And I've, just even taking histories, it's so incredible how many of them are, had a childhood exposure to mercury, for example, from their father's dental office or their mother's prior mercury history. So one hypothesis is that there is a direct correlation between the depletion of glutathione, which is the antioxidant that helps contrast the oxidation of thyroid peroxidase and the activation of the antiperoxidase antibodies. So this is an interesting and very compelling hypothesis that I came across through a training and through the Metabolic Healing Institute. So it is, I'm definitely not the only practitioner and clinician who has seen a correlation between mercury exposure, mercury toxicity, and autoimmune thyroid disease. It's very rampant for sure.
So if I hear you right, what you're saying is in terms of Hashimoto's, because Hashimoto's technically would be elevated thyroid antibodies. Is that correct? So what mercury is doing is mercury is inhibiting the enzyme that neutralizes those antibodies?
Pretty much the antioxidant that would help reduce the oxidative stress from the thyroid peroxidase.
Got you.
I may not be explaining that completely right, but
no. I think you're explaining it right. It's a lot of big words that I have to try to let my brain process. But I understand what you're saying. Basically, mercury exacerbates the problems that come with Hashimoto's, which is a huge problem that I know mostly women deal with. But I mean, there's plenty of guys who deal with thyroid issues as well. And, one thing that I notice, especially in the mental health space, is so many instances of depression or even something like chronic fatigue. They get diagnosed as depression and chronic fatigue, but really a lot of times it comes back to hypothyroidism and issues with the thyroid specifically.
Sure. Yeah. And then you have to wonder what was the root cause of that thyroid dysfunction. You just have to keep following the roots.
Yeah.
And, it's almost like being underground and following a trail from one route to the next.
Yeah. And that's just a question you have to ask, and it seems like you as a practitioner ask that question, which is digging into a person's mercury exposure. And I'm sure you could find this on a hair tissue mineral analysis where you could say, well, you have elevated mercury and then you have these symptoms of, depression or chronic fatigue or whatever it is. There's a probably a substantial link between those two. And then you're also saying that it can sabotage the communication between the HPA axis, which is another major neurological pathway, in terms of creating problems with stress, with anxiety, that you see a lot in the mental health space as well. And a lot of people are taking a lot of different, be it pharmaceuticals or different supplements to try to figure out how do I calm my stress response? How do I calm? And then, there's all these different things, lower your blood sugar, do meditation, yoga. But a lot of times, it could be, again, digging way deep into your mercury exposure and seeing that, no, you actually have this metal that is physically sabotaging the whole process.
Absolutely. Yeah. A lot of anxiety, depression, insomnia, overwhelm, lack of resilience, even things that get diagnosed as post-traumatic stress disorder can definitely have a heavy metal component. I have seen mixed mercury and copper toxicity in people who have a diagnosis, for example, of bipolar mood disorder. It's really, really interesting. And sometimes mercury will not even show up elevated in a hair test. And those are the people that we worry about the most, actually. The people who have really high mercury levels and the people who have really low mercury levels in their hair. In fact, autistic children almost invariably have less than 0.08 parts per million of mercury in their hair. Basically, you would be hard pressed to find somebody with hair mercury excretion that low who is not autistic.
And is that because it's the tissues holding on to the mercury?
Yeah, it's an inability to detoxify the heavy metals because of impaired antioxidant status.
Wow. So to kind of play off this, off the hair mineral tissue analysis, you're talking a lot about copper, and copper is so fascinating to me because it's one of these minerals where it's either toxic or it's deficient, and there's really like a Goldilocks zone. So maybe you can explain a little bit, because it seems like this interplay of copper and mercury is really the smoking gun more than anything. And then you throw lead in there and you throw these other metals, but it seems like the common thread you're seeing is the interplay of copper and mercury. So maybe you could talk a little bit about, copper, people's exposure to copper and kind of what you're looking for as far as, is it toxic? Is it deficient? Explain a little bit about this copper element.
Sure. So copper is a really fascinating element because you can actually be both deficient and toxic in copper at the same time. And that's the real ripoff of the whole package there, because it really has to do with how the transport enzymes are working. So for example, if you have proper adequate intake of copper, but you're not producing enough ceruloplasmin or maintaining sufficient levels of ceruloplasmin, you can have a lot of unbound copper in your blood that goes rogue. It has been described as sort of a Jekyll and Hyde kind of phenomenon. So you could have insufficient transported, properly bound copper that is not oxidized to help cross-link your collagen, to help support good connective tissue function, to help support balanced immune system health. We need good zinc and copper balance for all of these things. And then, also for good hormonal balance, we also need healthy levels of copper. But if too much of your copper is oxidized in your body, even if your total copper is normal or even low, you could have copper toxicity through an excess of oxidized copper that can definitely mess with your brain. So the typical kind of pattern would be just, it's described as wired and tired. Just like people whose brains go a mile a minute, but their bodies just totally do not want to do anything. Extreme, and this is not obviously specific. So, if you hear a pattern being described as, matching up with a specific heavy metal toxicity, if you're listening to this podcast recording, don't assume that this is the cause, because all of these things they're not necessarily specific or unique to either mercury or copper or combined mercury copper toxicity pattern. There could be
so
other
what is the biggest way then that copper becomes oxidized?
Well, if not enough of it is properly transported on ceruloplasmin, then you just sort of have copper hanging out in the blood, and it gets oxidized or rusty. If you just to simplify, that can definitely happen due to insufficient antioxidant status in the body. So you're more susceptible to that if you already have high levels of mercury impairing your glutathione production and recycling ability.
Yeah, and I've heard this concept before of the importance of ceruloplasmin, right? Because that's really the transporter, essentially moving around things like copper and iron. And, a lot of times this is the mistake of people in the supplement world, where they say, like, for instance, something like iron, they say, well, your iron's low. And so what do people do? They start supplementing with iron, right? Yeah. And really that's the worst thing you can do as far as I'm concerned, because supplemental iron, it's not technically bioavailable iron. And sometimes what it takes is actually going back to the actual, maybe there's a breakdown in your transporter, which is what it sounds like you're saying, which is in terms of copper, it's not that you have too much or too little copper. It's just that the copper is not getting to where it needs to go. So what exactly, maybe you can kind of explain better than I can, but what is ceruloplasmin and why is it so important?
Well, I wish I could be a little bit more detailed and accurate, but just think of it as like a boat or a car that is designed to contain and transport copper. That is, I think, the best way that I can explain it right now.
Sure.
It's almost like, so, if you don't have enough of your copper bound to the transport molecule, it's almost like having a business and you have, 20 employees, but they're not properly trained and they don't really know what to do. So they're sort of going rogue and, your business is collapsing because they literally have no structure. So it's not that you have too many employees. They just aren't doing what they're supposed to do because they don't have the proper guidance and support.
And this sounds like it kind of comes back. Does this also play into the antioxidant status as well? Like your glutathione status can directly affect because I've heard it's also something having to do with retinol, like with vitamin A, can help build ceruloplasmin.
Yes. So vitamin A, vitamin E, and vitamin C are really important really important vitamin sources of antioxidants in the body. In addition, zinc is a really great antioxidant. You, of course, do not want to improperly supplement with these. And I always recommend whole food sources before experimenting or tinkering with supplements, because sometimes even a supplement that you might need, if you time it wrong or you dose it wrong, it can definitely backfire.
Yeah, that's a thing people, especially now we're in coronavirus time, everyone's hearing about, zinc and vitamin D, and everyone's running out and getting ample amounts of these things. But, as a mineral specialist, you probably know, and you just kind of alluded to, it's like, you don't just want to just start throwing zinc around, because all of these things work in ratios. And I don't know the exact mechanism or reason why, but maybe you could talk a little bit about, zinc toxicity and why zinc is so important to get from whole foods versus just simply supplementing it.
Well, yeah. We get zinc mostly from our animal foods where it's most bioavailable. There is zinc in plant foods, but it's a lot harder for us to extract and absorb it from plant foods. I've definitely noticed by tracking my own nutrient intake that even eating a diet that is, moderately abundant in animal foods, that many days I'm not meeting my zinc requirements. So I do modest zinc supplementation based on my sort of day-to-day zinc intake from whole foods. That is an area that I monitor in my own health situation, because it is an important mineral. And I once supplemented with what I thought were modest doses of zinc in a moment where my body was obviously not equipped to handle it. And I actually had some hematological and immunological consequences from that. I was doing a couple of other things too. I was taking low dose alpha lipoic acid as an antioxidant support, which I don't recommend, by the way, if you have a history of mercury exposure. And I was taking 15 milligrams of zinc, and I was taking, I think, something like 1,000 IUs of vitamin D, in addition to magnesium and vitamin C, which I had already been taking. So my immune system totally crashed. And
wow.
I went to the doctor with my lab tests in hand, and she looked at me and she said, "Sarah, are you feeling okay? Did you ride here on your bike? Are you okay?" I was like, "Yeah, of course I rode on my bike. I don't have any other form of transportation." And she was like, "Gosh, I'm so worried about you." And she handed me my lab form, and there was the white blood count line and the neutrophils line, and they were both in red, and it said alarm, and nothing had ever happened. Like, I'd never seen anything like that before. My immune system was completely suppressed, and I had to have a bone marrow biopsy. I had repeated bacterial infections. I literally still don't know if it was the too much for me, or too, wrong timing for me zinc supplementation, or if it was just too much vitamin D for me, which, 1,000 IUs per day, that does not sound like a lot, right? But, or the alpha lipoic acid, or some combination. But like, this is a classic example of improper supplementation. This is back in 2014. It can backfire, even if it seems very bland and very kind of, conservative, because I didn't think I was doing anything crazy, but it was totally crazy for my immune system at the time.
Yeah, this is the stuff that drives me crazy. And it's such a great example that you highlighted, which is you're taking these nutrients that, you can look anywhere online. You can look in very reputable, health blogs, and listen to doctors talk, and they'll tell you, take vitamin D, take zinc, take alpha lipoic acid. But what they don't tell you is how these things actually work. It's just kind of a given, like, well, if I take these things, and it's going to help my immune system. And I've heard from so many big platforms, by the way, encouraging people to take these exact things, 5,000 IUs of vitamin D, high dose zinc, especially during this time of the coronavirus. And to hear that it had that effect on you, where it actually suppressed your immune system. And that's the thing we're missing too, is we keep saying we got to boost the immune system, right? Which is, to me, a fundamental misunderstanding of how the immune system works in the first place, because that's where your problems come from, when you boost the immune system. So you were saying you had hematological issues. Is that because there is a balance that happens between something like zinc and iron?
Well, I think in my case, it was more zinc and copper, possibly. I certainly, in my hair mineral tests, I definitely had a long-standing pattern. I ran my first hair mineral test, I think it was February of 2014. And for the first 4.5 years of running hair mineral tests, a couple times a year, there was a long-standing pattern very strongly suggestive of hidden copper toxicity. I had a pretty high zinc to copper ratio, which is actually, in my case, it had a lot to do with zinc loss through overexcretion. And, it's called zinc wasting. It's very common for people with a history of mercury toxicity. And I was just not properly using copper in my body. And it took me several years of just slow, patient work after my initial debunked attempt that, what I thought was a conservative supplementation protocol that was appropriate to my situation. It totally wasn't. The great lesson learned after, a good 7 months of severe immunosuppression with a very serious life-threatening infection, for which I was hospitalized with sepsis. Great learning experience for sure on, slow and steady bio-individual work and lots of patience. I completely reversed my retinal degeneration. I had 2 conditions affecting my vision severely, which I believe were directly linked to a pattern of combined mercury and copper issues, which reversed in concomitance with a normalization of my copper transport per my hair tests. So I was diagnosed in my mid-20s with retinitis pigmentosa, and I had the eye doctor telling me that I should never drive, and that I had serious visual field deficits, and that my retina was basically full of holes, and that I would eventually go blind. And then I was diagnosed in my late 30s with bilateral macular degeneration. And I completely reversed the macular degeneration, and my retinitis pigmentosa reversed to the extent that my retinal specialist sat me down and she said, "Look, you need to tell me what you've been doing, because my entire training and clinical experience tell me that what I'm seeing in you is impossible." And I told her, I removed my amalgam fillings. I rebalanced my mineral status. I worked on rebalancing my copper. I completely removed gluten from my diet. And I'm just eating lots of whole foods that are good sources of the nutrients that support eye health. I literally didn't even have it on my radar that my vision health could improve, because I have a serious family history of retinal degeneration and, just progression into blindness. So I just literally believed it when I was told this was my genetic destiny. And
wow.
One thing that I learned by doing hair tests across the generations of my family was really enlightening, because now I'm missing one generation, because my mom has never done a hair test. But when my grandmother, bless her heart, did a hair test when she was 89, she had the same exact pattern of copper dysregulation that I had. And I took a history from her, and she said, "Yes, honey, when in the 1940s, in the years leading up to your mom's birth, I lived in a small town that had a copper and uranium mine." And I was like, "Oh my God, this answers all of my questions." Yeah. So
that's so amazing.
It is trippy. Yeah. And she literally never thought that it had anything to do with her health or, my mom's health. We have a family history of connective tissue disorder, and proper copper function is so important to good connective tissue health. So, probably there was some weak genetic terrain, but certainly, a mixed pattern of mercury and copper, mercury toxicity and copper dysregulation can hugely worsen this type of pattern.
Well, and you also said something too in there where you said you stopped eating gluten, which I would imagine, I'm just shooting it out there, but it sounds like the benefit of that was you probably fixed some leaky gut issues. So your gut started absorbing these minerals better to help balance the whole thing.
Yeah, absolutely. I really believe it was an important part of removing inflammation from the barriers, from the digestive barrier in particular.
Yeah, because that inflammation, especially if you're talking about copper being oxidized, what more can oxidize something in your body than oxidative stress from inflammation, right? Yeah, definitely. It's just hugely stressful for the body, and it depletes nutrients and it impairs your ability to absorb, and it can impact, even your mental health, because if your nervous system is just always
overstimulated in the way that it can be with these patterns of toxicity, you're just constantly in sympathetic fight or flight mode, and you just never rest. Your body is in a constant state of cellular danger response, and that's just not a state where you're really absorbing and assimilating nutrients and healing tissue.
I mean, that's the crazy thing about this whole thing that you said is all of these parts, that you're telling me that mercury can affect your HPA axis, your gut, your ability to make stomach acid, I mean, these are important, like you said, that are just going to be self-perpetuating mechanisms. Like you just said, if you can't control your HPA axis, you can never turn off your fight or flight, which means you can never stop cortisol from essentially disrupting all of these other processes, which keep you in a constant state of oxidative stress and inflammation. If you can't make stomach acid, then you can't break down food properly. You're going to get more leaky gut. You're not going to be able to absorb the nutrients that could balance your copper, which means this problem just keeps getting worse and worse. And not to mention, it depletes your glutathione. So you can't even make the antioxidant to help you get rid of this thing in the first place.
Yeah. It's quite the downward spiral. But the good news is that by addressing it, by understanding it and addressing it properly, there are huge margins for incredible improvement. I mean, I literally could never have even imagined some of the positive health changes that I've had over the years. It did not happen overnight. It really didn't. But, when I think back to my health journey, even just in the past 5 to 7 years, it's just amazing and almost overwhelming to think how far I've come.
So let's get into that then. Somebody's listening to this and they're sitting there thinking, I think I might have mercury toxicity. I have the fillings. I have these exposures. What does somebody do? Where does somebody start to start to address this? Maybe they don't have access. And granted, if anybody wants access to, a hair mineral tissue analysis, we'll put Sara's information in the show notes so you can contact her if you want to contact her as a practitioner. I run the hair mineral tissue analysis. There's plenty of practitioners who do, so there's plenty of resources. But somebody's thinking, they don't want to go that route. They want to start to address this alone. Now, you said, I know the first place I go is alpha lipoic acid, 200 milligrams can start to rid mercury of the brain. And by the way, I know there's different kinds of mercury that we didn't even get into.
Sure.
So real quick, if you can just address, the different types of mercury and then where you would start to address it and why you think alpha lipoic acid is not a good reason or not a good method to get at this problem.
Well, I
just threw a lot at you. I know.
Yeah, it's a lot to unpack. Essentially, once mercury enters your body, it doesn't hugely matter what form it originally was in. It gets oxidized and taken up into the cells. So mercury, I think that the route of exposure is more important than the form of mercury. So for example, you have more ability to detoxify mercury when it comes into your body through the gut. So mercury from fish is probably easier for most people to detoxify than mercury that you breathe in vapor form, or mercury that is injected in the form of ethyl mercury in a vaccine, because you have fewer defense mechanisms. Now, unless your defense mechanisms in the gut, in the form primarily of metallothionein enzymes, which by the way are driven by copper and zinc, which can both be depleted and antagonized by mercury, but usually zinc is more depleted than copper by mercury. Once you absorb mercury, it's basically methylated in the body, and then it's just stored. Your body, once the half-life in the blood is very short because it's so toxic that your body just takes it away wherever it can. And a lot of mercury goes to the brain because it's lipophilic. The brain is full of fat. So the nervous system ends up taking a huge hit. And when you move mercury around in the body, I mean, there probably are situations where the proper targeted use of alpha lipoic acid is beneficial to people, but I really do think this needs to be done with professional experience guidance. There are different protocols. There are concerns that have been voiced about keeping the levels of alpha lipoic acid in the blood stable. So its half-life is about, give or take, 3 hours during waking hours and about 4 hours during the nighttime. So if you have a faster metabolism, it could be a little bit shorter of a half-life in your body. And if you have a slower metabolism, it could be a little bit longer than that in your body. But people who are taking alpha lipoic acid in low frequent doses definitely notice. If, like some people will say, exactly at 2 hours and 46 minutes, I would start to get a headache. And I knew that I was behind. So essentially keep the idea in the frequent low dose chelation view is to use lower doses. So over the course of a day, you could be taking, that 200 or 400 a day milligrams total, but you're not doing it in just 1 or 2 doses. You're doing it in 9 or 10 doses divided throughout the day in equal parts, which I do believe is probably safer. By the way, that is what I was doing. I was taking frequent low doses, being very careful. And yet I still had negative effects. So my body may not have been ready. I don't exclude the possibility of someday going back to alpha lipoic acid. I'm not opposed to the idea, and I do think it has a lot of potential. But I literally am studying the mechanisms of alpha lipoic acid in the body. Because I think that it's important to understand, because it is such a complex and rich supplement, because it has antioxidant qualities, it has neuroprotective qualities, it has the ability to help you regenerate and produce glutathione. It can help with blood glucose control. It can do a lot of really good things. But I do think that it is important to understand its mechanisms of action in the body, the way it interacts with other nutrients, and any individual contraindications or precautions that we should be aware of. In my case, I was definitely missing something. I'm actually interested in studying this stuff. I have a pretty chunky, multi-100-page little like college reader type thing, spiral bound collection of articles that I have printed up on alpha lipoic acid. And I am planning to write a scientific article on it along with a small team of people, because I do think it's really important to sort of collate and gather together the mechanisms of action and just help educate the public on the benefits and the proper bio-individual use in a framework of caution. So I'm not really discouraging people outright from using it. I think it has enormous potential, but I do think that it really does need to be bio-individually adapted in terms of timing and the person and the dose and the frequency and all of that.
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, again, it just goes back to the whole idea, that we were talking about earlier in regards to even zinc and vitamin D, that even though it's an antioxidant, even though it has, great properties and detoxifying properties, depending on the person, it needs to be used responsibly. And these are powerful substances. And this is what I talk about all the time on this podcast, with holistic nootropics, which is, nootropics too are powerful and they can definitely have benefits. But if one thing is not necessarily good, one thing is good for somebody is not necessarily good for everybody. And you have to really know your own bio-individuality and your own needs. So there's so many different routes we can take this conversation. I want to be respectful of your time. This has been such an interesting conversation. We've covered so much. I know, if anything else, this has brought me to even more questions I have about Mercury, which is really the whole idea of these podcasts. So, Sara, I definitely thank you for joining me today on the podcast. Before we sign off, is there anywhere that you'd like to direct anybody listening or anybody watching to find out more information about you?
Sure. The easiest is my main website, buildnurturerestore.com. And if you kind of, play around on the website, you'll see that there is under the restore section, which is the section of the website dedicated to complex chronic illness. You'll find my compilation of resources that I put together on Mercury, including an article and a YouTube video presentation, which explains many of the things that I talked about in some depth and detail. So I think that's really the best way to find out more and to learn more about me and my approach.
Yeah. And it's a great website. Lots of amazing resources. I've checked it out myself. You do have that good video that you did at, I believe it was the Silicon Valley Health Institute, which is fantastic. So to learn more about Sara, be sure to check out her site. We'll put all of the resources that she mentioned and I mentioned in the show notes today. You can check that out at holisticnootropics.com/Sara Russell. And with that, Sara, thank you for joining me today on the podcast. I wish you all the best. And viewer, listener, thank you for listening today. For more on all things nootropics, including all the scientific references and everything you can think of about nootropics, be sure to check out holisticnootropics.com. We'll catch you on the next episode. Peace.
Thanks for listening. For more brain-boosting info, in-depth articles, and show notes, check out holisticnootropics.com.